Hello and welcome to another episode of Meye, the podcast where we speak to phenomenal women from Bangladesh and across the diaspora and learn about very interesting things that they're doing and how they're making a difference. Once again, today I'm joined by my co-host, MJ. MJ, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Doja. How are you?
I am doing great and I'm very excited. Today we have with us Narmeen, an Emmy award-winning journalist in New York. She began her journalism career on the assignment desk at Capital News 9, Y&N, followed by roles as a writer and producer. Her first on-air role came in Syracuse at News 10 Now, Y&N, where she worked as a multimedia journalist, shooting, editing, and reporting daily. Narmeen, it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Narmeen, let's begin with your interest in journalism. How did that all start?
A bit by accident, I think, unintentional on the part of my parents to influence me on this one, because as I'm sure you hear over and over again, a lot of Desi parents and Bangladeshi parents don't usually encourage their kids to go after careers outside of medicine or engineering. Right. My dad is a clinical pharmacist, and he very much wanted me to pursue something in the medical line. But growing up in Queens, I remember we just used to always have the evening news on. And my father used to flip through all the channels, watching all of the major evening broadcasts. And it really became this big influence in my life as a child and into my adolescence, even my father quizzing me on world capitals and countries and world leaders, and always emphasizing that no matter what community you live in, the global current events, how much it plays into everything that we do. So that was where the kind of influence came from. And I kind of very secretly went about, I say secretly, but it wasn't so secret. It was just very quietly went about pursuing journalism, in the sense I didn't really tell my parents when when it came time to applying to colleges, that I was pursuing more journalism-led programs. And even after I graduated, I think they were a bit in denial until the first time another Desi family had spotted me on the news, and they happened to be accidentally at the same gathering. And they were kind of, just proud that there was another brown girl up there. And my father was like, suddenly that's all it took was affirmation from someone else in the community that this was the right way to go.
Right.
And there you go. And this is motherhood and working, right? You hear
Oh, absolutely. I think we're just going to let that be there. And not try to.
And then we'll hit pause on this one for a second. Let me go hit scat on that one. Okay.
Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. I think Dadi is taking care of it on the other side of the door.
So Narmeen, I wanted to tell you that you were the reason why I started watching Pix11. Just seeing a Bangladeshi woman out there on TV, like talking about different issues, that totally inspired me. I was glued to Pix11 every time you came on.
That really warms my heart. I mean, honestly, it sounds cheesy maybe to say, but I was like, it's one of the biggest reasons why not only did I pursue journalism, but why I continued on. I mean, there were many different times in the course of the career where I think it would have been easy to give up, because there's so many challenges as a woman, as a brown woman, as a Muslim woman. There's so many challenges and hurdles across the way. But like, to hear you say that, it's so important to me, because I didn't have the opportunity to ever turn on the television and see anybody that looked like me or had a name that took up as much space on the bottom of the screen as mine. So it became really important for me, to have, even if one person could turn on the TV and see a semblance of themselves, then that was me on the right path.
And the way you described your parents, like their reaction, just seems so typically Bangladeshi to me when I think about it. It's like, it's like you're doing drugs or something like that. You're like, Mom and Dad, I went to journalism school, and they're like, oh my God, how could you do that?
Yeah, and it was, and I will say, the biggest thing about it wasn't so much the profession itself. It was because my father really loved journalism. I think what I realized later, it really was about livelihood. Like, you come to this country, and my dad, like, we came here so you wouldn't have to struggle, right? And journalism doesn't pay well. Like, And especially in the beginning, you really have to achieve a certain level before you see the paychecks turn into something more than just trying to just making ends meet. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So my father was always very concerned about that. So here I was living in Albany and Syracuse in these tiny little apartments. And I very gladly talk about the salaries I was making. My starting salary was under $20,000 a year. So, I mean, think about that. I mean, that's not a livable wage, is it?
How does that work? Why is that industry like that?
I say it's a very good question. And I say one of the biggest flaws in journalism is how it dilutes out very good talent. There were some amazing people I went to journalism school with. There's very great people that I worked with in entry-level positions that eventually that ended their journalism careers and went to pursue other things in PR or marketing or something else because they frankly just couldn't make ends meet on the salary. It wasn't a livable salary.
It almost feels like it reinforces some kind of privilege. I mean, like if you've got generational wealth, then
100% it does. The issue with the salary is a big one for me because I think it really whittled down some incredible talent. And unfortunately, it was a lot of Black and brown folks who ended up being the ones that had to leave the business because it was unaffordable. You couldn't live on the salaries that were being offered. And my parents were just out of Queens and, had bought a home of their own. They were really trying to build their own lives. So I wasn't, hitting them up for money left and right. I was really trying to live on this. And it was hard. It was genuinely hard. I mean, sometimes you're like, I can't, I don't know how to make a basic car payment right now. Even getting a car took a minute, I had to borrow another car from family, for a few months before I could save up enough to buy my own. So, I mean, these things, and then a lot of times you would be surrounded by a lot of people who had generational privilege in the TV industry, a father who was a somebody, a manager, a previous anchor, it felt very fraternal in a lot of ways. And so, that was like a big and difficult barrier I was attempting to cross because I didn't know anybody. Nobody pulled me in, I didn't have, a lot of people had somebody who pulled them in, somebody who knew somebody who knew, that can get them in. And I call my situation pure luck.
So what kept you going though? Like what made you say to yourself, well, you know what? I'm going to make this work. This is,
pure drive and passion, I think. I think it was pure drive and passion for journalism. I just really could not see myself doing anything else. I mean, most certainly there were moments that I wanted to try, do something else if I was really frustrated with, I'm watching all my other friends live these glamorous lives in New York City. And I'm sitting here sipping on ramen noodles. I was like, wait a second, what am I doing wrong? But no, it was really something that I just could not see myself doing anything else. And I genuinely loved the job itself. And there was just this one component, which is a pretty big component in life, which is a livable salary that became a challenge. But I kept telling myself, let me just get to the next step, and I'll get there, So somehow, I don't know, I dug in and did it.
So would you say it's passion and believing in yourself?
Big time. I think you have to believe in yourself. I think it's, and as a young kid out of college, it's hard to believe in yourself. There's a lot of people that are older than you. The business is cutthroat. People can be mean. You encounter a lot of challenges for sure, but there is absolutely a point where you have to see in yourself that you're going to continue to get better, that with the right guidance, mentorships, which thankfully I did eventually gain, you start getting better.
And how did that happen? So who were your mentors in the industry? Who were the people that were supporting you, guiding you? And how did you form those relationships?
In college, was one of my first mentors. He was, his name was Bob Zelnick. He was a professor of mine. He's a former ABC News correspondent, old school. He was a correspondent at the Pentagon, in Moscow, in Jerusalem. And I did a lot of a lot of classes with him: media law and ethics, foreign reporting, covering international terrorism, And he was just really interesting to me, and always was somebody who was very like, we would have a lot of disagreements about media coverage over certain things. That was like part of our classes, like engaging in discussion of stories and fairness and bias and things like that. He was somebody I would often have disagreements with, but at the same time, he respected my perspective as I respected his and could learn from him. So he gave me a lot of incredible advice about loyalty, because there was this tendency, and I don't think this is journalism specific. I really think this applies to like any job. We tend to get so loyal to our employers. Like if you have a really nice work situation, or you feel like you trust a certain manager, they're making you promises like for promotions and things like that, you really are like, okay, I'm really going to stay for the long term. And so one of the things that he would say to me was, the worst thing you could do in this business and journalism he was talking about is be loyal, because nobody has your back but yourself. At the end of the day, this is a business, and they're running a business, and it's not about fulfilling the promises we made to Narmeen. Like if you were ever mistreated or, not followed up upon, it is only you that will be able to watch your own back. And there were times where I stayed at a couple of jobs, maybe a little bit too long. And he's like, what are you doing? What did I tell you about this loyalty thing? And I'm like, oh yeah, there's that. So, yeah. And it always used to every so often pop back up to me, just in terms of making sure that you watch out for yourself.
So I'm curious to know, when you are reporting it from out in the field, what kind of stories were you covering, and what kind of people were you meeting, and what did that give you growing up in Queens and then covering basically, New York that is not New York City? What did that look like, and how did they perceive you, and what was that interaction like? I'm kind of curious to learn.
Yeah, no, I think it's it's a really important perspective. I remember when I was initially just job hunting in New York City, and there were a couple of news directors and some of the other stations who were, they would say, they were like, they had a little issue with my name, for example, how do we make this name work? Could our viewers pronounce it? And I'm like, do you know what Chaudhary is? It's like Smith. Come on, that to me became really telling about some of the people leading some newsrooms, and maybe they didn't quite understand the demographic of the city, and maybe they were used to appealing to a certain portion of the population, and not all of our 5 boroughs in New York City, for example. And so story-wise, I covered the gamut. I covered crime, I covered politics, I covered education. The interesting thing at Pix 11 was that it being a kind of a smaller operation than, the ABCs, NBCs, and CBSs, we didn't really have beats per se. You would sometimes over a period, but not permanently. We don't have an education beat reporter, necessarily. So I covered a lot of that. But in the last few years, I really was covering a lot of social justice, community issues, racial injustice. And, the last year and a half was COVID exclusive almost, but not just COVID exclusive. It was also the neglected communities where we saw, when we're talking about living in the epicenter of a pandemic, so many Bangladeshis in our community reached out to me about the neglect their communities were seeing. And I don't believe they would have felt as comfortable reaching out to others, or maybe their stories wouldn't have been covered as quickly, so having a voice that is diverse or different from what the majority of your newsroom looks like is incredibly important, because then you're reaching into other communities that you're neglecting to cover, if that makes sense.
Right. So, as we were speaking about this, I realized that I don't know much about the news channels and how those are organized. I kind of think of ABC, NBC, and then there are other local affiliates, and I really have no understanding of it. And I'm just curious to know if you could give us sort of just a brief synopsis of what that looks like. And also, I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are going to be curious to know, would probably look up to you as a role model and would like to know how they can emulate you. So, if you could say something about if someone wants to make it as a journalist, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, I think the path's changed a lot too. When I was first in the business or getting into the business, you really had to start at these very entry level positions and work your way up. And I I don't think that necessarily is true anymore. I mean, we see a lot more people coming in who don't have journalism degrees. Sometimes it's taking very entry level like jobs at the assignment desk. Mine required a journalism degree, and now it doesn't necessarily. So really, you have to, starting at those entry level places, but also if you do certain things on your own, there's this social media tool that's incredible for people, right? So if you kind of make a name for yourself doing a podcast on your own, or recording little snippets of yourself on Instagram, if you're like an influencer type thing. Sometimes I've seen a lot of those folks jump into the business as well. I do believe, I'm very old school in the sense, I believe a foundational start in a degree in journalism and writing is incredibly important, because if you can't write, what are you doing?
Right.
I'm really crazy about grammar. So it's like, you can't, the worst thing is to have somebody who comes in thinking, oh, my hair looks perfect and my makeup looks perfect, so I should naturally be on television, but you can't write a story. You can't put together a story. I would be surprised. A lot of people would be like, wait, you write your own stories? I thought other people wrote them. I was like, no, I write it all myself. I used to edit it all myself, but thankfully, like later I could focus just on the writing, and we have an editor who puts it together, but you're really involved in the process beginning to end. And it's important to know all elements or the components of your story, because it's your work. It's how you're portraying a particular issue. And so it's important to know how to write. And you were talking about the differences. I mean, in local news, it's very hyper local, covering the 5 boroughs. Network size, networks have changed so much, right? But I mean, a lot of times if the story is big enough, especially in New York City, could be local news, but is anything really just local in New York City? Not really, right? So a lot of networks would pull from, information that local news reporters are gathering. Yeah, I mean, the networks kind of obviously have this much bigger reach in terms of audience nationally and at times internationally.
So yeah, I lived in DC for a while, and then one of my friends was a reporter for the Washington Post, and then I ended up meeting a lot more journalists through my friend, and that's when I really got an understanding of just the rules of journalism. For example, one of the things that I'm remembering is she had said that if no one's going to claim it, you can't report it. Something to that effect. I'm not remembering exactly correctly. And I feel like the people that you're kind of describing that would jump into, I would call this quote unquote journalism now. I mean, like, it seems like they're not bound by any of those, or they don't even know about those. And I'm wondering what you think that does to journalism when somebody who's an Instagram influencer is now all of a sudden in a newsroom. I don't know if that's what's happening, but
yeah, I mean, it's and not to put down anybody. I mean, I don't want to, obviously there's this direction that things, like journalism, I guess, is taking. And I don't think there is a place where you're going to stop that from happening. I don't think I think we've gone past those days where you can stop people who view themselves as influential from becoming these on-air personalities and or sometimes eventually news journalists, because managers and people who run news operations, I mean, they see an appeal there in terms of viewership. So if a person is a draw, they will likely be hired. I think it comes down to training. I think it's really important. I mean, sourcing is incredibly important. I mean, when people talk about misinformation and so much bad information being out there, my number one question is, can you trace the source? I mean, that's instilled in me as a journalist, but I realize that a lot of regular folks, if you will, right, don't necessarily think of asking themselves that question. But it's a very important one to ask every time you read something. Where is the sourcing? Where is the information coming from? Not just who was the last person that posted it? Where did it originate from? And that is very important, because sometimes people will start circulating video, about something that's happening in current events today, and you realize it's something from 5 years ago.
Right.
And here it is at this point, shared thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times. And this is an irresponsibility. I mean, I don't share and post outside of a lot of traditional news sources for that very reason. I am very careful. And frankly, I have a very easy rule. If you have to think twice about posting something, don't post it. Because outside of even just journalism related, I was like, there's a lot of things people post that can get them in trouble down the road, right? So if you have to think twice about something, then maybe sit on it for a moment.
Right. And what you said about tracing the source, really, journalists are safeguarding the truth, right? I mean, like, if you can't verify it, well, then it's not going into my story, but that doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm not talking to that person directly, I mean, when we put together stories, we're directly talking to sources and we're attributing information. Attribution is incredibly important in journalism. And this might bore some people listening, but I think it's incredibly important for the integrity of journalism, for the purpose of transparency of information. Mm-hmm. Attribute. Where did it come from? Even if you're saying it as an influencer, where did you get it from? Is it directly from a person who is impacted? It can't be from the person impacted's friend's mom.
Right.
You can't report that.
Right. So, Narmeen, that does bring me to my next question. We saw, like, in the past, I guess, 5 years or so, we saw this rise in, like, quote unquote, fake news and what can be described as an assault on the truth, an assault on journalism. I'm just curious to know how newsrooms dealt with that. Were they blindsided by that? How are they reacting to it now? How are they dealing with it now?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think initially blindsided, I think it was so gradual that, maybe it did come out of left field initially because you never saw so many people question facts. And it was gradual, and now it's kind of spiraled into this. I mean, it's wild to me how large the factory of fake news has become, mm-hmm. and how much a journalist's job now has become trying to dispel the myths and separate that from the facts. It's sad, frankly, to me, because I think it takes away a lot of important news gathering. I think it takes away a lot of important content because there's so much time having to be spent on dispelling misinformation. But it's also it's a new part of journalism, really deep fact gathering and ensuring that the public gets the right information. It's become a new responsibility, and it's something that everyone's had to kind of adjust to. Mm-hmm. It's challenging. It's frustrating, of course. But it's also at the same time very necessary because it's not going to stop. So the best you can do is really, it adds on a lot more work a lot of times. And mm-hmm. And sometimes despite it all, people will continue to believe what they believe. But I think it's multi-pronged. I think their journalists' responsibility to dispel misinformation exists now more than ever. Mm-hmm. But there's also this responsibility of the consumer of that information. I think people need to be more informed. We need to be more or less susceptible to clickbait and become more of an informed reader and have a responsibility to know where their information is coming from and take more care in how they spread information. Mm-hmm. But I'm not really sure that that there's many people up to that task. I mean, sometimes it's just so easy to get information on the go and on the phone, mm-hmm. that the consumer of the information seems to be taking in less time to work for finding out where it's from.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking because, as the whole Russia invasion of Ukraine unfolds, I mean, like you're seeing all these graphic images and you're hearing all these first person accounts of atrocities that Russia's committing over there. Mm-hmm. And there are and these are journalists from major newspapers, from major news sources that are seeing mm-hmm. these things firsthand.
Absolutely.
And I'm just wondering, well, how soon before that becomes fake news? I mean, this is even something like torture is no longer taken seriously, that can't be safeguarded. And I'm just wondering, and you mentioned deep fact gathering. I think I heard you correctly there. And I'm just wondering what that entails. Does it almost seem impossible to if someone wants to just believe what they want to believe?
It certainly feels impossible sometimes as a journalist because the frustration is real. Whereas, in maybe previous circumstances where you would have to have one source to confirm certain information, now you may need multiple sources, which is harder, especially if you're dealing with classified type information and things like that. So the benefit in the US, I guess, is that we have so-called freedom of the press, right? So you don't have a government entity stopping you, where the challenges in other countries is that you do at times have government entities preventing you from telling the whole truth or elements of the truth.
Yeah. That is true. I mean, it is. I think that was one of the sad things. Witnessing that in the past 5 years has been very sad because, I mean, I think America lost something there because, I mean, like, well, we coming from Bangladesh, we are aware of how bad things are and how great things are in America. This is just my opinion here. I'm not asking anyone to share it, but it did seem like there was journalism that was, or rather journalists were spared this whole politicization or these kinds of politically driven attacks. And it feels like America lost something there.
Yeah, and it didn't. And I think a lot of people thought that after the 4 years of President Trump's presidency ended, that it would kind of go back, and it hasn't. I mean, I think this landscape of journalism and the flow of information and current events and this fighting misinformation. I mean, we're in new territory, and that was created then, and it's here to stay for the time being, at least. I don't think it's going away. So what it's done really is just, sure, made a journalist's job harder, but I think forces some of us to be even more careful. If we were not careful before, then you are more careful with the way you're putting together your information, so that there is less reason to question the integrity of your work.
Right. So, Narmeen, I'm curious to know a little bit about your experience at Pix11, and some of our listeners might be aware of the circumstances of your resignation.
Sure.
But was hoping we could talk about it. What was that like? You joined at Pix11, and then tell us about your experience there.
Yeah, it was a good run, and I did not want to leave when I left, but I was left with no other choice.
Mm-hmm. How long were you at Pix?
I was there just shy of 10 years. December would have been 10 years, but I resigned at the end of June last year. So just shy of my tenure at Pix11 is when I left, a few months shy of it. Mm-hmm. So, and I had earned a very senior level role there. I was, a regular fill-in on the anchor desk. And what was happening there was at the hands of one particular employee. And I filed an HR complaint years ago about Islamophobic remarks. And
so this person, just to elaborate a little bit, so this person was making Islamophobic remarks?
He had made a Islamophobic remark to me. And then later it was, we learned that he had made numerous other comments to other people.
I see. And was this person in a senior role, or was this person in
No, that was the interesting thing. I mean, he was a freelance photographer and at the time. So it just wasn't something that made much sense. He appeared to be protected and for a long time. And I went into the process of initially, do I or don't I speak up about it? And me, if anybody who knows me, I don't typically stay quiet about anything, frankly. I went into HR a number of times and to my managers a number of times about these offenses. And over the years, nothing was really done. Inevitably, this person was fired for, again, Islamophobic related social media post that he had made that was reported to HR by another employee. He fought for his job back. He got his job back through arbitration with this station. And I was just forced to deal with it, is for lack of a better way of saying it. There was no protection for me, despite numerous threats of lawsuits and threats of, him saying that he would come after me, this and that. So it just got to a point where, and again, this was something I was dealing with for a number of years. And I like to now talk about it in less emphasis on the person, but I think it's the station and a combination of higher ups who failed to protect the employees, because it wasn't just me. There were others who had come forward about other claims from sexual harassment to other racially offensive comments. It was an equal opportunity offender that was protected, and the employees, all women, Black, brown, minorities, were the ones that failed to see protection from the station. And I think a lot of people are worried and scared to come forward and speak up to their human resources department. And even though this didn't go the way I wanted, I would strongly encourage people to still continue to speak up, because I hope that what happened to me doesn't happen again. But the only way it won't is if more people don't speak up. And I hear too often that people didn't think it was important enough to go to HR to for, and, or, they just, or they didn't want to make a ripple. They didn't, and listen, I'm guilty of it sometimes too, because as a minority, I would be like, keep your head down, focus on your work, and don't make bad ripples,
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I realized, no, like if there is no record of this, then it's as if everything's perfectly fine. And it was far from it.
I guess what prompted you to not be that model minority, take the model minority approach of like, keep your head down, do your work, and, don't make bad ripples. I mean, like, what made you like,
because I'm not that way in life. I mean, honestly, I was always a little bit rebellious, maybe. I was always somebody that was outspoken. I was always somebody who believed in speaking out for, I spent my entire career speaking out for others and holding other communities up and giving voices to these communities who were otherwise marginalized. And I could not, in good conscience, continue to walk into a newsroom of all places and continue to be a victim. It just didn't make sense. If I didn't stand up for myself, how dare I stand up for anybody else, And I have two young girls. How could I ever look them in the eyes years later and say, Mom just never stood up for herself and continued to stay in an environment that, listen, it turned into it was bearable to unbearable. I got to a place where it permeated so much of my life that it became incredibly toxic and unhealthy for my own mental health. Right. It was not a safe place to be for me anymore. And that's the most important thing. I felt unsafe, unprotected, and I had to do everything in my power to get to a better place. And the only option was resigning and walking away and believing wholeheartedly that once I recover and from that experience, that the right news station, the right future in journalism is there for me. I have to believe it.
Yeah. What do you think enabled that kind of behavior? Like, what do you think? Why do you think the station didn't stand up for the accusers, but then for these, these people who are harassing? Why were they protected, and why not the women that were coming forward?
I can't speak to that. I can't speak to like what made them do what they did. What I can kind of say is, I think we've entered this territory where a lot of employers need to figure this out. We can't sit here and wait for individual categories of minorities to come forward. You have to treat all of them equally. I strongly believe that if his comments were anti-Semitic in nature, anti-Black in nature, a more forceful hand would have been taken. And unfortunately, Muslims appear to be the weaker minority in a lot of places of employment where its comments against us are just somehow acceptable, or that they're just not racist enough for action. And that is something I can't stand for. I am somebody who, I may not wear a hijab on my head, but I believe my faith is incredibly important to me. It's a big part of the foundation of who I am. And for anybody to dismiss the comments that were made to me, and even other statements that were made to other people as acceptable, they need to take a hard look in the mirror, because I think when you don't treat all minorities the same in the workplace, you're going to continue to have these issues.
Yeah, it looks like there's some work to be done on that front. So I suppose if you had to give advice, given all that you've experienced, given all the barriers that you overcome, I mean, all the things that you sacrificed to get to where you were, and that's going to take you to the next level. What advice would you give to somebody from Bangladesh, like a woman who wanted to follow in your footsteps? What would you tell them?
Just to not give up. I mean, I think there's always going to be roadblocks in the way, and always going to be these challenges. I just think look to your support systems, look to your mentors, look to the people who believe in you. I mean, that's a big part of what keeps me going all the time, whether it's my husband and my kids are the easy ones to point to. My father is a big one. But my core group of friends and family who are nothing but encouraging and loving and believe in you. And even, MJ, folks like you, like when you said that I'm the reason that you watch pics, I'm like, man, I miss this. Like, I want to go back to it, So look to the work that you did, look to the work that you did, believe in that, believe that you're on the right path, and stand up for yourself. I think too often we're forced to be kind of quiet observers, and I don't think that's the way we should be any longer.
That's true. I mean, that's definitely advice that we should all heed, that we shouldn't really just be quiet model minorities. We really need to be heard, and we need to stand up for ourselves.
Yeah, maybe I think that was a little bit of our parents' generation too, of like fitting in and finding their way in. And some of that may have rubbed off on us, early on. But I think very quickly, I was like, these days you look around and there's so many of us, there's so many people from so many different places that, employers can't afford to lose our perspectives, so it's important to force them to see it, to understand the benefits that we bring to the table. And that can't happen without us talking about it more.
Absolutely. So, Narmeen, here's a question that's, we've talked about some very important things, but this is me selfishly asking for advice, I guess. I've tried. Okay. I've tried my hand at stand-up briefly, and
interesting.
It was. Yeah, that's what everyone described it as. But no one described it as funny. They described it as interesting.
I doubt that.
But I was petrified up there. And how do you do this? How do you get in front of a camera and keep your composure and not succumb to stage fright?
So some people don't believe me when I say this, but like obviously when you're on television and, various groups will invite you to do a public speaking event or host an event, MC events. And I have to be really honest, it is nerve-wracking for me. I get very nervous, sweaty palms. And people are like, how is that even possible? You're on television every single day. And I'm telling you, it's two totally different entities. So getting up on a stage and speaking in front of actual live audience, it's very nerve-wracking. I think it takes a lot of mental preparation to do it. I think practice makes perfect. I mean, on air for me, there's no question there was stage fright initially. Mm-hmm. You could be very confident in the work that you put together and wrote out your story, and you know all about it. And the second that red camera light goes on, and mm-hmm. You're on, it can be nerve-wracking, and it is scary. But practice makes perfect. I think over time, going from a young cub journalist to someone who's more seasoned and more veteran, you mm-hmm. build more confidence in your abilities, and you will get better. And I know it's cringeworthy, but it's very, very, very important to watch yourself. Have somebody record it. And those things that you find annoying, you can work on it. I mean, I had to work a lot. I used to have it much, like, even when I was in college, one of my professors said, "Are you really serious about this? Because that New York accent." And I had a very, very thick New York accent. He was like, "We got to work on it. And I had to sit there and like old school My Fair Lady style with a recorder, was doing diction, practicing pronunciation. So the same goes, for public speaking. I think, I have to prep, sometimes talk in front of a mirror a few times, be confident in what I'm writing out. And people have different methods. Some people like to write everything out mm-hmm. word for word. I really think that's distracting, because if you happen to have a hiccup there, then really have a hard time catching yourself. Whereas I think bullet points are much, much better practice. Mm-hmm. And practice just being conversational and being yourself. That's the most important thing. Don't try to emulate somebody else. Everybody has their own style, and you have to be your own person and speak the way you do, not the way you watch some television presenter do it.
Yeah, I'm writing all of this down, by the way. This is what I'm used to.
Okay.
Yeah, no, this is just advice from me to continue to do this podcast, bullet points again. Don't
Hopefully it's helpful.
Yeah, it is very, very helpful. So with that, Narmeen, that concludes our conversation. It was so wonderful to have you on the podcast. It
was fun. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's always, the best thing about this job is getting to meet all the wonderful Bangladeshi women that are doing amazing things out there. And you're certainly no different. And this was a treat. It's unfortunate that the world is so messed up, for the lack of a better term, and certain people get protected and other people don't. But to hear your story, you've achieved a lot. I mean,
I appreciate that. Thank you. I think there's a power in numbers. I think that's why I talk about not being afraid to speak up. And, we know that these experiences exist and in unfortunately larger numbers than we think. So it's important to keep a record of it.
Absolutely.
You know how they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger?
100%. I believe that.
Yeah. We really need you back out there. Girls and women like me, we need someone like you to tell our stories.
Send me positive energy and I hope to get back.
No, we're rooting for you. We really want to see you back out there. We want to see one of our own back out there. And you were even
Inshallah.
Yeah, you're brave for having done what you did. I mean,
Thank you.
That was the right move to make. And we need more of you out there. So looking forward to seeing you back out there again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Narmeen. This was great.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for having me, guys.
That concludes our conversation with Narmeen Chaudhry, Emmy Award-winning journalist, Muslim Bangladeshi woman, and truth teller. We hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation as much as we enjoyed speaking with her. Do tune in for more episodes, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the Meye podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube.